Hello, this is Wes Bridle, and this is another Kingdom Calling Economic Update video. It's been 2 or 3 weeks since we did the last one, so I think it's going to work out to be 5 videos just of what's been going on since the last time we shot these economic updates. All of these videos follow on the bigger full live presentation called The Coming Storm that we did in November 2009. If you haven't seen that, there's a link right next to this video where you can watch that for free, and that's really important because that gives you a big picture of what's going to be happening in our economy, whereas these videos are just talking about what's been happening in the last couple weeks. So that being said, I think I'm going to shoot one video here on hyperinflation and gold news, and then shoot a couple on just things going on with the government and the financial reform bill, as well as what's going on in the economy and the stock market. And just as far as a personal note, we have a baby due probably within the next month. So after I shoot these 5, I don't know, there's a good chance I'll be shooting some more regularly soon, or we might be at a hiatus. I have no idea. My life's going to change quite a bit. But we'll be coming back at some point whenever that makes sense in our lives. And so let me jump into it. Richard Russell recently said that there's 3 things to understand about deflation and inflation. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, the Fed is not going to tolerate deflation, that they will print money until they have inflation, and that then people will panic from the dollar and run away from the dollar and run towards gold. So it just gives you insight from somebody who's watched the markets for decades and really has an understanding of what's going on. It's the same thing we've been saying for a long time. There's a lot of deflationary pressures out there, and in a coming video we're going to get into those things. But the end result we still believe is going to be inflation into some degree of hyperinflation. The IMF recently told Europe that they need to inject more stimulus. We're in a crazy place where on one hand, we have huge problems because the governments are just spending far more money than they're bringing in, and that's really bad for stability everywhere. And yet, if they stop spending this money, that's really bad for the economy. And so we have a double-edged sword, and we're stuck on one side or the other of it. Europe has decided the smartest thing, the wisest thing to do, because in large part, Germany remembers in 1920 the horrors of hyperinflation. And so Europe is pulling back. The IMF is telling them you need to be doing the opposite. You need to do what America is doing, just printing money without end. Interesting, China, because they've been hurting, they started pulling away from the dollar about a year ago and started moving more towards euros. And of course, the euros crashed recently, and so that's been hurting them. So the China instead of euro has been buying a lot more Japanese yen. And they've also said recently that they will not do the nuclear option with the U.S. dollar. They will not just wholesale dump it. And so they're basically telling us that in the meantime, while they said that we need to get our act in order and protect the strength of the dollar because they hold a couple trillion of them. But one thing you need to realize, they have a lot of banking issues. Their banks, because the government told them they had to, did a lot of really stupid things here in recent years. And as they start having bank problems, China's going to have to come up with the money to bail those banks out. Where's their money? It's U.S. dollars. They might have to dump a lot of U.S. dollars, even though that might not be their intent. So something to keep an eye on. Also, David Rosenberg had a great point. I've seen it quoted several times, and I'm paraphrasing. The U.S. turned 234 years old last week, and more than half of the nation's money supply has been created since helicopter Ben Bernanke has come into power only 4 years ago. So out of 234 years, he's created more than half of the nation's money supply. That should scare you because that money is not backed by anything other than our full faith and credit. When we print them at that speed, our full faith and credit isn't worth very much. Stansberry and Associates brought my attention to something. 60% of the world reserves are in U.S. dollars. When the government needs money to bail out their banks, that money will be sold, and that's a huge problem for the supply-demand factors for the U.S. dollar. Another point is that the Fed, in order for the Fed to protect against this, they're going to go out and buy a bunch of European trash bonds in order so that the European economies are not doing this. Again, it's more and more printing. And he's actually, a lot of times I'm repeating him. He's actually repeating something we said in our last newsletter. If you receive our newsletter at kingdomcalling.com, you'll see that we already predicted this a month ago. We're going to end up more and more bailing out Europe. And at some point, the world's lenders are going to look to us and say, wait a minute, where are you getting all this money to bail everyone out? You don't actually have any money. That's when we have problems. Jim Rickards recently discussed his theory that Russia would use a gold-backed ruble to destroy the value of the dollar. And it was really fascinating. He pointed out that the spies that were picked up in New York recently, it seems like they were up to a bunch of silliness, but the one thing that Russians seemed to be very interested in was gold information. And so this Rickards theory that he put out a couple of years ago, that Russia would demand payment for their resources, which they have a ton of, things like oil and natural gas, that they would demand payment in a gold-backed ruble, and that this would destroy the sanctity of the US dollar, because all of a sudden that would become the preeminent currency in the world, and people would then look at the US dollar and see it's just not as strong, it's not a backed currency. And so his theory is Russia could be doing this in order to make a power play, and really there's nothing illegal or even really immoral about it, but it could absolutely take down our system because we're built on a house of cards. And so it was just interesting to see. Now if you look, Russia posts every month, they add to their gold supply, so they're quickly trying to catch up to the amount of gold that the US and a couple other countries have in the world, and they're just sucking up all that local production, and they do mine quite a bit of it. So it's been pretty interesting theory, and interesting to see how the spy ring shows that Russia is pretty interested in the subject. There's a new UN report calling for the abandonment of the US dollar as the world reserve currency, and they call for the IMF's SDR, the special drawing right, it's kind of like a currency, or something like that to take over. Again, we've been documenting this for 8 months now. Many people, important people and agencies around the world calling for the dollar not to be the world reserve currency anymore. If that happens, that's doomed to the dollar. That means all the dollars that you have become worth far less than they are today. And the Chinese let their yuan float. There's a G20 meeting in Toronto, and we've been bugging them for years. The Chinese let their yuan float just a little bit. It's not exactly floating. It didn't move up to its true inherent value, which is probably double where it is today. But they let it move a little bit, which is a big step. A lot of people think it was just political. I'm kind of in that camp. I don't think they have any plans to let it move a whole lot, but more to appease the politicians of other countries. But it did move a little bit, and so it's something to keep an eye on. One thing also to realize, though, is that if they're letting the yuan appreciate, that means they need to buy less U.S. treasuries in order to keep the peg of the yuan to the dollar. If they're buying less treasuries, that could be trouble for the U.S. dollar, because we need to borrow tons of money to run the huge deficits that we run. There's not very many people or countries in the world that can afford to lend us the money. China is the biggest one. If they're not lending us that money in order to support that peg, that could be trouble for us. China has increased holdings 2 months in a row. So we've reported here for a long time that China was decreasing for 5 months in a row. China decreased their holdings of US dollars. When the trouble in Europe started, they've actually increased their holdings for a couple months in a row. It's still not back to where it was a year ago, but they have been increasing their holdings. And it looks like it's going to be 6 videos because I'm only halfway through the signs of hyperinflation and gold news, and so I'm going to make an extra video to talk about that. And again, if you haven't seen The Coming Storm, it is an hour-and-a-half presentation that shows you exactly what's going to be happening in the economy, and that's really important. You can watch that for free on the linked video. And just message me if you have any questions. Thanks, and God bless you.